Welcome to the OG Original Glory Podcast. I'm your host, John Carlson. I'm here with my boy, King David, affectionately known as KD.
How you doing?
KD, what's up, man?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, no, I'm glad to be here. I mean, it's a little toasty out there today, but it's good to be here. Good to be in the studio.
Our first podcast is exciting.
It's our first podcast. Yeah. I know. It's.
How do you feel about that?
It's kind of bananas, man. I mean, we've been talking about doing this for a minute now.
Yeah.
Been toying with the idea for a while. Obviously, like, we feel as though God's given us a direction.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good to actually be in here, getting this down,
Yeah.
and pushing into what the OG Original Glory Podcast will be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little bit surreal because I've watched and listened to so many podcasts,
mm-hmm.
and now to be on the other side of that and thinking about what those look like, and those have their own identity and own message.
Mm-hmm.
And now to be here and think about, okay, what's our identity and what's our message going to be? And I know you have the message, but I'm excited to just kind of see how this flows, how we get going.
Yeah, that's really good, man. It occurs to me that it's a lot like a word from God, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get this word, but then you move into it and it opens up and it becomes like a lot bigger and a lot richer, or like a scripture, right?
Yeah.
Like, a scripture rings your bell and you're like, oh man, like, you just know in your soul that God's speaking to you, but you move into it and all of a sudden you find yourself in a situation in life and you're like, oh wow, like, I'm actually moving into that scripture. It's becoming like a moving, living, active thing,
right?
Practically speaking, in my life. So, maybe that's what we'll encounter here. I don't know. It's going to be real interesting. It's going to be really interesting. So,
well, I'm thankful too. I'm thankful that I get to be here, and I enjoy being your friend and watching you create. I think you're a real good creative guy, and it's awesome to see how Jesus works through you and how that flows. So I'm super excited.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, I appreciate you being with me on the journey. I wonder if they'll edit out the squeaking of my Hydro Flask, or if we'll leave that in the episode. I don't know. We'll see what they want to do. Yeah, but we appreciate you joining us. Those of you who are out there in podcast land, whoever you are listening to this, those brave souls who have decided to jump into the OG Original Glory Podcast. And we thought it would be really good to invite you into our origin story, to kind of introduce you into things rather than just making a bunch of statements about like who we are and what this is going to be about. We thought we'd invite you into the story a little bit. We will say at the onset that we're followers of Christ, and that identity really is going to fuel a lot of what we're going to talk about here.
Yes.
However, we're not in ministry. We're not pastors. We don't work at a not-for-profit. We're out there in the marketplace just like you are, slogging it out. KD was slogging it out in the marketplace until 8:30 last night.
Yes.
Working hard before he came in here. And we walk with God, right? Like that we believe that's central to life. That the good life, a life well lived, is a life that's lived walking with God. And so those two themes are going to be present in everything that we do, really. So,
yeah, walking with God. What does that even mean? I mean, in my journey, coming to know Christ and trying to figure out these, Christian cultural words that like once you're in the community, you start picking up, and I heard that a lot. And until I met John about 10 years ago, and the rest of our band of brothers, a small group of men, didn't really know what that was. And I started just listening to their stories and hearing what that actually means, walking with God. And I heard some of the most craziest, gnarliest, funniest coincidental things. And it was just, I don't know. The saying is you just can't make this stuff up. And so I'm excited to share that with our listeners, because it just had such a deep and fruitful impact for me.
Yeah. Yeah, one of those men that you're alluding to, the guy who coined the phrase, we call him the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
He was saying that last night. He's like, I'm gonna write a book. And it's gonna be called, you can't make this bleep up, and it's true. It's wild stuff. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. In the spirit of that, I mean, this really has its origins in Original Glory, the clothing line, which we'll tell you about. By the way, if you want to check us out at originalglory.com. You can check out our gear. You can check out our additional resources and everything like that there.
In the blog.
I'm excited. The blog's going to be good.
There's good stuff on there coming.
Yeah, it's going to be good. So, but this started out as an idea for a clothing line. And, we wanted to create an identity-fueled message that speaks to the heart and do that through the medium of clothing that people love to wear. But that was something that I began to work on, like 5-6 years ago. And it just got put on the shelf because I owned and operated a really very busy, very successful business here in town. And we sold that business at the end of last year. So it got put on the shelf for a season. And, that takes us into somewhat of the origin story. I mean, this goes back a lot further, but, last year, in May of last year, kind of trucking along, we had the enormous blessing of operating one of those businesses that was, very successful during the pandemic period. There was a cost to that, in that it was very, very busy for the last 3 years. So I was a little bit worn out. But in about May of last year, God started to speak to me, and he came to me and he said, John, I'm going to sell your business. And, I was like, well, Lord, that we just re-upped our lease agreement for 3 years. And, we're planning on working this out for like another 3 years at least. It's going really well financially and everything like that. And I'm like, so Lord, when are you planning on selling the business? Because I've learned that you need to ask the next question. When God says something to you or you ask him a question, he gives you an answer, you want to ask the next question. And he's like, I'm going to sell it really soon. And I'm like, okay. And I was wondering if I was hearing him correctly, am I just worn out? Am I just burned out? But, within a month, he brought us a potential buyer. A large national franchise brand reached out to me about acquisition of my business. And I'm like, okay, all right, well, I'm intrigued, set up a phone call with these guys. And I basically said, look, my business isn't for sale, but if it was the right deal, I'd be open to having that conversation. And ultimately, we moved through that conversation and we moved through the sale of the business over like a 6-month period. And it was very interesting. It was a really, really interesting process to be engaged with. KD was actually one of 2 guys that I invited into the process and invited to pray for me, be a confidant in that. In these processes, you have to keep them pretty close to the chest because, as one mentor said, loose lips sink ships in these these deals, right? So had to be careful. But David and a gentleman who's much older and wiser than both of us and has actually owned and sold a business as well were confidants and guys that were praying in the process. So they had visibility to what this was like for me. And that 6-month period had a lot of highs and lows. But God was very consistent. Jesus would just be like, I'm selling your business. This is something I'm doing. Really, really consistent throughout the whole process. And there's no way any of this would have happened if he weren't in it. So we get to the end of last year. We close the sale transaction, and I start to look at what's next. Not so much in the sense of what's next career-wise, but what's involved with the transition. You mentioned your soul at the beginning of the podcast. At a soul level, I knew that I needed to get eyes on the story, especially the last 6 months, right? I knew that I needed to get eyes on the entire time that I'd owned this business, which was about an 8-year period. And as I began to dive into that a little bit, I kept the conversation going with God. And in that process, he's like, I'd really like you to write out your entire story of walking with me in the marketplace. And I'm like, I could do that. And he's like, yeah, why don't you write your story of walking with God in the marketplace, and we'll kind of dig in a little bit. And we kept the conversation going. I started thinking about this a little bit more. It took me a little bit of time to actually get around to it. It's a pretty big project. It's about a 20-year career at that point, So, in there, I began to realize that there are a lot of good stories out there in the body of Christ. There's so many good stories of men and women walking with God in the marketplace, in the context of raising families, doing all kinds of different things, like just the ordinary, everyday things in life. And I thought about, like a podcast, and God's like, well, what if you did a podcast and use that as a platform for telling some of these stories? Because there really is outside of the church, there's really no one platform for getting stories out there, and that tends to be a little bit limited because it's kind of filtered through whatever particular church that you go to, which is, it's a beautiful thing. We both go to church and everything like that, not bagging on that, but it is what it is. And so this idea kind of got birthed in that process. I write out my story. I begin to talk to some people, engage with some people in my world, in my network. And I had a conversation, for example, with one mentor who's a previous boss of mine. And he's like, you have to tell this story, And
That's
I'm
awesome.
like, really? Okay. And, it's just God, like speaking, affirming, moving. Another example is I'm talking to some dad. I don't even know this guy at a basketball game. I kind of tell him Cliff's Notes version of my story. Most of my career, we had some commonalities in being in medical sales. And he's like, that is a great story. So that continued to be the theme. And when I told people about the podcast, they were pretty enthused about it as well. I had coffee with a friend of mine, and he's a good dude, doing the deal, trying to walk with God. Really, really good man, very successful man. And he made the comment, he's like, he's like, you have to do that. Like, I feel like an army of one out there, And so at no point did God bring anybody into my world that was like, oh, that's stupid. You know what I mean? That story, that sucks. There was none of that, right? So he's just moving, he's affirming. He really even did it in very intimate and personal ways. Like, this is a really cool story. I went to a prophetic night at this church that we've been going to, and I went with my daughter because my son was sick, and so my wife and my son stayed home. And they get to this portion of the evening where they're like, we're going to speak a word over the group, and if it resonates with you, we want you to stand up, and we're going to pray over you and some things like that. And I'm like, I just knew that they were going to say something that was going to cause me to stand up, right? When you get that feeling, and I was not in for anything weird or being outed, and I didn't want to stand up. And the whole time I'm like, Lord, if you could give a word for Ashley, my daughter, that'd be great. Like I just, I'd love for a word of encouragement for her, but not for me. Well, they get up, and the word they spoke was marketplace, and I'm like, okay, that's me.
Boom.
So I stand up, right? And it's beautiful, right? Like, people behind me laying hands on me, praying for me. Ashley's laying hands on me, praying for me. Like, they did a wonderful job with it. We're walking out of this thing, and me and Ashley are talking. She's like, yeah, it was really cool. You got a word, Dad. I thought it was really cool how they did this with this guy and that with that guy. And I'm like, Ashley, like, when we get in the truck, I'll show you something really cool. The day before, I started to write my story of walking with God in the marketplace in a Google Doc. And that's what I titled it. So I open up this Google Doc when I get in the truck, and I go, hey, Ash, read the title of this story. And she's like, that is really cool. I'm like, don't you just love Jesus, So again, just moving, affirming, directing, really, really guiding, really making it very clear that this is something that he has for us, and I'm talking about myself and David, and I'm talking about those of you out there listening. this is something he has for all of us. We really need to engage in these stories. And I will say that, what I'm describing, this listening for God's voice, this conversational relationship, it's something to be cultivated. This didn't look like a conversational relationship with God where I had this much of an interactive relationship with him, 15, 17, 18 years ago.
Right.
It looked more like, taking the step that was in front of me at the time, getting guidance from like an older man and, someone who had wisdom and things like that. And, kind of maturing into, learning to relate to God through things like scripture and everything like that. So, there are even further origin stories that we could really tell, but this is the more immediate origin story. So anything that jumps out to you?
Yeah, I mean, this is how the podcast got started, right? Walking with God in the marketplace. I think it would be good as we progress, not today, but over further episodes, to share some of those things with people. Because there's a lot there on how to cultivate hearing from God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so powerful. That's not even the right word. It's more, I don't know, powerful is doesn't come across to me connotation-wise as relational. Like, just to have that kind of relationship with Jesus, to even have that be a category that Jesus wants to talk to you today about your life, about right now. Like, that takes a while. It took me a while, I should say, to even accept that or wrap my mind around that. And
why is that? Why is that, do you think? Because I'm sure a lot of people could identify with that.
I think the way I grew up, the people I was around, I wasn't taught that.
Yeah.
It's not a criticism to my parents, or I was raised in the Catholic Church. Did all the sacraments. At one point, I was even a retreat leader for my youth group once I graduated. And it's just not something that was part of the curriculum. That's not something that I think for me in that circle, it wasn't there. And then, so that's a kind of a surface level answer.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a deeper answer, which just comes to like, am I loved? Does God love me? Am I worthy of the God of the universe to speak to me? I think so. I'm a little nervous to dive into that because my soul's in rough shape right now. So
yeah, that's fair enough. We won't press too hard on that one.
Maybe I'd love to, maybe another time, but
yeah. No, understood. I mean, that raises so many thoughts and so many stories in my mind. But to ask you a follow-up question, would you say that a more conversational relationship began once you joined our band of brothers, once you became more part of that group? Is that about the
it's
time
actually
frame?
Interesting, thinking about one of the benefits from writing out our stories is just to look at and reflect on, where did God interact and when did he intercede on our behalf? And there are times like when I was graduating high school and had a major decision to make, and I prayed about it. And I didn't have this category. I didn't know God wanted to talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I prayed and I asked God for help. And I kind of felt it in my heart. And it was God speaking to me. But I didn't have the spiritual maturity yet to understand it, to interpret it, to even recognize it.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt it. And I couldn't even tell you or explain it to you. Like 18-year-old David couldn't share that with you. But I can now, looking back on it and looking back over my story. So you don't even need to be trained, or, God's talking to you, whether you're listening or not, it's happening.
Yep.
And he's there, which is kind of cool too. I lost track of my thought. What was the question?
It's okay. It's okay. No, that's really good. Well, my question is when, I suppose now, when did you begin to kind of cultivate that? Because like clearly he's a communicator and he's speaking, and that raises a really good point. I was thinking about that on the way over here as I was kind of mentally preparing for what we would talk about. There's the reality that he's speaking to us in all kinds of ways. He's speaking to us through the still small voice, like he's speaking in your heart. He's speaking through creation. He's speaking through other people.
Mm-hmm.
He's a communicator. And if you're open to him and you're looking for him to speak, he's gonna meet that need.
Yeah. So the next, I think, really massive time he spoke to me in a loud way. I was going through a really difficult time in Tucson, and another story I'll share at some other point in time. Decided to move to Phoenix, and as I'm looking for a place to live, I just drove to Phoenix. It's a couple hours away on a whim to look for a place. And I got that same feeling again that I just described. And I found a place. It wasn't on any of the lists that I had created. And every place I went to, I got turned away. And I'm about to leave and head home. And I just kind of got this feeling that I should go check out this apartment complex. So I went there. I checked it out. They had a space open. It's exactly what I was looking for. So I secure it. And then come to find out, that's exit 13, which is my lucky number. And what's significant about that is that's right next to the church that I went to, and going to that church got me into recovery, which got me also into our group of guys.
Yeah.
So that was the next, like, really significant, where I was really struggling, and kind of just felt. And then that brought me into the group. And then once I came into the group, started learning about these different categories and learning how to listen and decipher the voice. And then it got real. And then there's some crazy stuff that happened.
That's right.
Really crazy stuff. It was good. It was really good. It's funny now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's wild once you start to really intentionally look for that. Once you realize that he's speaking, start to look for it. I mean, wow, some things really do open up.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to, so I moved to Phoenix and went into recovery, joined our group of guys. We weren't even a group of guys at that time. I just started meeting the guys and kind of learning to walk with God and listen to God and have that conversation. I ended up getting, this is a funny story. So I was not happy where I was working. I felt like I was performing well. I think my boss at the time disagreed, and it was coming to, after a year, that we had different expectations of each other, and they weren't being met on either side. And I was pretty miserable. And I prayed every day for probably a month. I remember in the shower, and I was like, can I quit? God said no. And I prayed again. I'm like, can I quit? And God said no. And then finally, one day, I'm praying in the shower again. I'm like, God, can I quit? And he said yes. And I'm like, are you serious? And he's like, yeah. And this is a big deal. I'm paycheck to paycheck. I don't have a backup plan. I don't have another job to go to. So like, quitting is a fairly dramatic, significant event. And God says, yeah, you can quit. And I don't know how this is going to work out. So I'm like, okay, did I really hear him right? And so I go into work, and I'm kind of happy, kind of uneasy. So lunchtime comes, and I'm like, God said I quit. So lunchtime, I'm in my office, and I'm writing my resignation letter. And literally after I finished writing the letter, I wrote the last sentence. I get a knock on my door, and HR wants to talk to me. I was like, okay. And I walk into HR and they're like, we're going to let you go.
Oh, man. I remember this. I remember that story. And I remember this season of your life. It's crazy.
And I'm like, good, it's lunchtime. I can go catch a movie. The day's not over yet. It was bonkers. And yeah. So there's more to that. And then, then I didn't have a job for 4 or 5 months. Kind of tried some stuff on my own, some entrepreneurial things, some marketing things, and nothing was panning out. And then I got this random job offer. It was a contract position out of Tucson. And I really didn't want to go back to Tucson. My life is now in Phoenix. My son was in Phoenix. The biggest pull to come back to Tucson was that the girl I was dating was from Tucson, and that girl's now my wife. And so I get the contract, and I'm praying about that, and I'm asking God, what do I do with it? I didn't get the contract. I got the opening and said, do you want to apply for this job? And God said right away, no, you're moving back to Tucson, and you're going to get this job. And I was like, wow, that's very decisive and direct. So I'm excited. I call up my girlfriend. I'm like, hey, God said I'm coming to Tucson. I'm going to get this job. And she's super excited. And we're like, great, we're going to have to no longer long distance. And it's going to be so fantastic. And so the recruiter calls me and sets up the interview. And I'm like, well, what do I need to know? And he's like, go look up this thing and you should know this and you'll be good. So I go down to Tucson. I go interview. It's a major company, a company that I've wanted to work for quite some time. And so I was kind of nervous. And it ends up being the worst interview I've ever had. And I'm literally batting 1,000 at this point in time. Every time I've gone into an interview, I've been offered the position. So my interviewer was extremely tough and just criticized and questioned every answer. And then on top of that, the interviewer was upset because I didn't know the software package that they use. And I didn't do my research up front and come in prepared. And I just kind of took it on the chin. And then my girlfriend at the time, takes me out to lunch. It was an hour long. And we exit the interview and he's like, well, I got 2 other guys to go talk to, and I'm going into this meeting right now, and maybe we'll get back to you. I don't know. So I'm like, great. I'm like, what's up, God? Like, this was supposed to be a slam dunk, and I just got rocked. And so I'm kind of like irritated and sad, and, we're eating a sandwich, and the recruiter calls me. And then I lay into him. I'm like, I can't believe you didn't prepare me. They wanted me to know the software. Why didn't you tell me? And the recruiter's like, he's really nice. He's like, oh man, I'm so sorry. It's all good. I apologize. You're right. We should have prepared you. He handled it really well. I was actually really impressed. And that diffused it. And and he's like, but I need to tell you something. I'm like, yeah, what? Like, I'm expecting bad news. This is 1 hour after the interview, literally 60 minutes after the interview. He's like, they've made you an offer.
That's bananas.
And this is a kind of company, like a large company where you go through multiple rounds. It takes weeks to hire people. They don't make a decision in 60 minutes and make an offer. And he's like, yeah. And they want you to start on Monday, like the next week. So that means the guy that interviewed me during his meeting made the decision to hire me and canceled the 2 other candidates that were supposed to come in after me.
Wow.
And I was like, wow. And my wife and we're just like, man, God, you're amazing. Like, are you kidding me?
So much for performance, right?
Oh, I know. Yeah. I mean, and I feel like maybe he even did that on purpose. Like, yeah, he's like, if I got you, I got you. It doesn't matter if you feel like you suck or whatever. He's like, I'm running the show.
Right.
Like,
yep.
You just let me, handle things and trust me, and let me be your father, and let me take care of you. And it was beautiful.
Yeah.
So it was really cool.
That is really cool. Yeah, it's something that I've learned as well, that it sounds really simple, but like if God says he's going to do something, he's going to do it.
Yeah.
And it's a very simple statement. It sounds like, well, duh. But it's like, believing what he says, believing that we don't have like spiritual wax in our ears, and that we can actually hear him, and then walking into that. And it doesn't always look pretty either, right? Like, what you experienced emotionally, in that moment, how did you feel were you like, have I lost my mind? Like,
yeah, going into it, like I knew I heard God, like I was packing my stuff before the interview. Like, I believe God, this is a done deal. And then, the experience of the interview was just completely opposite of anything I've ever experienced before.
Yeah.
And that just made me question everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I questioned God. I think I just questioned myself.
Exactly.
Like, am I crazy? Did I do something wrong? Yeah, I don't know. But
well, it gets to be increasingly high stakes too, because as you progress,
right.
It's like you have potentially like a girlfriend or a wife or a family or whatever that's dependent upon these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dependent upon, you're putting all your eggs in the I'm walking with God basket, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that's one thing where I tend to struggle a little bit. For example, with the sale of the business, really high stakes, right? I'm in business with my wife, and I know what I heard, but I'm like, oh man, like what if I heard wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not God, that's me,
right?
And what if I boldly declare this? Like, what's that going to do for my wife? What's that going to do for her faith? What's that going to do for her heart?
Mm-hmm.
So the stakes get to be really high, So I don't know. I'm with you in that. Like in this last season, I questioned what I was hearing. I'm like, on a certain level, I knew what I heard, right? Yeah. Just like you're expressing. But I think also, the enemy gets in there. This is like fertile ground, the big stuff. That's why you want to practice with the small things, because in the big things, and the enemy doesn't want you to follow the voice of God.
No, not at all. No, you look at how Jesus got tested.
Mm-hmm.
I've kind of always been distant from that story. I'm like, yeah, Jesus passed the test. Jesus was a badass, right? But I think part of like that story is also to show us like, you're going to get tested this way,
mm-hmm.
right? God promised me a job, and he promised me that job, right? I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to like take over. I didn't have to do anything. Just show up, be present.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the enemy wants me to like do the opposite of that. I should have trained harder. I should have prepped harder. I should have gotten this from the recruiter. I'm going to lay into the recruiter and show him,
Totally. Yeah.
Right. Like that's, yeah. Yeah, that's good. I'm just, really thankful. Yeah. And I'll never watching Stephanie light up like when all that happened, this is so cool.
Yeah, I bet.
It was so cool.
She gets way excited. So that had to be a moment of mourning was turned into a moment of joy, right? Celebration.
Yeah. Well, she was awesome. Like she was very comforting, and she's like, it's okay. Like, and you kind of, I think you mentioned this too, when you're talking about the origin story for OG, like you need your people,
mm-hmm.
right? Stephanie was comforting me in a really great way, but never doubting God. It was never like, oh, you must have heard wrong. Or she's like, no, it's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
God's going to come through with us. Like, we'll see. Like, it's just not how we expected it. Like, she was really calm. And I think that's really important and hard, right? Is you need people to walk with you. kind of like pull you out and help see that, hey, maybe this is the enemy coming against you. Like that's huge. That's really huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know for both of us, we've mentioned a band of brothers, you know, and so to kind of explain that a little bit, it's a band of men, a group of men that we essentially do life with. You know, we meet up a couple of times a month. We do all kinds of stuff together. We can add podcasting to the list now.
Yep.
That's a new thing for us. But you know, we get out of town together. You know, we adventure together. We might go snowboarding together. Watch the Suns, you know, do terrible in the playoffs and break our hearts every year. Oh, that's a fresh wound. Let's not go into that one too much.
I know.
But you know, we do all kinds of things together. But the intention of this group is to learn how to walk with God, right? Like that's our first thing. We're all mutually aligned in that we want to be followers of Christ who walk with Him intimately. And we also want to do that with other men because it strengthens us, you know?
Right.
And so that's been huge. That's been huge for me. It's been huge for you. I mean, we will definitely have to, you know, have an episode where we talk more about that in depth, but you know, you're hitting on that. Like it is huge to have your people for a variety of reasons. One for support and for comfort, but also like, you know, as we're learning together and as we're growing, we all have areas of strength, right? So it's like we learn how it's like us to act in certain situations, right?
Yeah.
We are encouraged by, you know, the stories that other people have, you know, their successes, their failures, and we learn from these guys, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was it like? You said you heard from God, you know, to sell the business. Was that in a prayer? Was that odd? Was that like a voice? Like how did that happen?
Yeah. We were on vacation up in Wyoming. I took my wife up there for her birthday. Took Andrew up there for her birthday. And I was just talking with him, you know. I don't remember if it was in a time of journaling. I actually don't think it was because I've had gone back and I've looked at those journal entries and, you know, there's some dialogue around it. You know, I'm kind of questioning it. I'm asking him questions and he's affirming at that point. But I believe if I am remembering this correctly, you know, I was just checking email or something like that. And afterwards I was walking around this room that we had rented, just like doing, you know, whatever it was that I was doing to get ready for the day. And he's like, I'm going to sell your business. And I'm just like, wait, what? You know, might have been talking to him about something. I might have not, you know, but it definitely felt like it came out of the blue, you know, definitely wasn't in my plan. So I was taken off guard a little bit, was also questioning it because I'm like, you know, am I worn out? Like, am I burned out? Is that me, like, you know, kind of projecting what I really want to have happen at like a deep level, you know? Am I house divided? Like part of me wants to stay in this and, you know, ride it out for a few more years because it's great financially. Part of me is done because, you know, I'm sick of dealing with all the headaches of this. So,
yeah, I mean, it was making you sick.
Yeah,
physically.
It was physically.
Do you think being on vacation was helpful to hear God?
It couldn't have hurt.
Yeah.
You know, it couldn't have hurt. It's interesting. My experience of God has gotten better and my body has gotten better. I've become more well and felt more like myself in the months that I've not been running that business because I just don't think it was a good fit for me. You know, I mean, I was good enough at it. We did well with it, but it just wasn't me. You know, you're meant to do certain things and I wasn't meant to do that. Although God had it for us, like very clearly, grew me up a lot in it.
Right.
Really thankful for it. Really thankful for the financial provision of it. But I mean, maybe it definitely doesn't hurt. I wouldn't say at this point in my journey, it's essential because he is just constantly speaking, right? Like I prayed about something yesterday, and I made a real point to go for a run. to pray about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he had already spoken to me about it. It's a business venture that I'm going into.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, yeah, we're doing that. Like, and it was really clear the way he opened it up, and I kept asking and everything. And I go out for this run, and my intention is to clear my mind and make sure that I really hear, although I felt pretty settled in it. And he's like, yeah, no, we're doing that. Like, kind of as I'm getting ready. And then he's like, I want you to pray for these people, that are on this mission, overseas or whatever, that you're supposed to be praying for.
Right.
And so we spent most of the time praying for that. And then, we kind of let that go and moved into praying over this, And so my point in that story is like, he's constantly communicating. And back to my earlier point, like all this stuff becomes higher stakes, really. I mean, these are all big decisions, right? Like they involve, they have implications that impact my family, my livelihood, my time, and everything like that. But I think what's ultimately emerged for me is we just have an ongoing conversational relationship. I don't always feel comfortable in doing the things that he asked me to do. Kind of along the lines of your story, like I don't know that I always feel like I do the things well that he asked me to do. Like I have my own, interview type scenarios, right? Mm-hmm. Where I walk into something and it's not pretty, but I'm doing what he asked me to do. And in a general way, I'm being obedient. And he blesses that, right? And it causes me to walk more in who I truly am.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he didn't say go interview and do a good job.
True.
He just said go.
He said go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and that's what I did.
Yeah.
And then, I actually became really good friends with the interviewer.
Really?
Yeah. And, he's like, yeah, I was just trying to push your buttons just to see.
Oh, really?
How you responded. And I was like, well, I guess I must have done it all right then. You did a good job pushing my buttons because I was pretty flustered afterwards.
That's really interesting.
So how would you, or can you circle back and talk a little bit about, you said, you heard God sell the business, and then you had a couple of guys that you were walking through that process of selling. Like, mm-hmm. How did those guys help you? How did those guys, can you share a little bit more about that story, or how that piece of the story?
Yeah, sure. So, you have visibility to it because you're one of those guys. So, you feel free to jump in. But, again, had to keep it close to the chest. Not something I normally do. Like, me. Usually when there's something big going on, I ask a bunch of people to pray for me.
Right.
Just like today, like it was kind of last minute for me anyways. Like I sent out a text to our band of brothers and I'm like, hey, me and Katie are doing this podcast. Like, would you pray for us?
Right.
That's my normal mode of operation. I've learned that is really helpful. We need the prayers of others. They're really important. I don't understand exactly how that works in the heavenlies, but mm-hmm. It makes an impact, right?
Yeah.
It's just the way that things work. So to only ask a couple of guys to be praying was a little different.
Mm-hmm.
It was helpful in that I knew some guys who walk with God, have my back spiritually.
Yeah.
Really helpful. They have different eyes to see and ears to hear, different lens through which they see life. They're not me. They have an outside perspective. They're not in it. So, I remember at one point, it seemed like the deal was about to fall apart at the very end. And you're like, man, I think the enemy's just messing with you. Jesus said he's doing this. I think we're good.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, right on. Thank you. And Wes kind of echoed that second sentiment. So really helpful from that standpoint, right? I think the friendship, and honestly, you touched on like the need for love, right? Like to have other people that just love you,
mm-hmm.
Is huge to have a couple of guys that love you and have your back.
Yeah, I remember that. And the enemy was trying to trip you up.
Yep.
For sure. Big time. Yeah. Because I think you were considering, doing something different, or how do I renegotiate, or do we go back? And like these things are, I mean, they're so weighty, but they happen kind of slow. Like it was 6 months, the whole process.
Yeah. And that's moving pretty quick.
Yeah.
For something like that, I mean, like these kinds of things can take like year and a half, 2 years. So, but it feels slow, but then things happen very quickly too, that like, are like little grenades that go off. And, I've learned not to react to things. Not that I don't react. I was just reacting to one of my children this morning, but, another podcast, but I've learned not to react. That like C.S. Lewis says, the highest form of being is response, and it's so true, right? Like if we can just like go, okay, like I'm reacting like inside, right? But I'm going to come away. I'm going to share this with some people and ask them to pray for me. I'm going to take this to God and I'm going to respond to what God's up to, as opposed to reacting to whatever chaos is going on in the world or what the enemy is up to and what he's trying to do, which is always bad, right? Like he's always trying to steal, kill, and destroy, and God is always up to something redemptive and good.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember when you would reach out to us too, it was more about this is what's going on, but you weren't looking for us to give you a solution, right? Or to fix it, or necessarily even like to comfort you, to say, hey man, it's going to be okay. It was more like, let's circle up and connect to God. And we would pray, and I would pray and just ask God for like a word, to speak over that moment in time in that situation. And then pray that. And that's always an interesting experience, to walk with God in that when you're praying for somebody else.
Yep.
Right. Kind of, it's very similar to your story about Marketplace. Like the person who heard that is going to be like, what the hell is Marketplace? That's the least churchiest word in the world. And that but it speaks direct to your heart. Oh yeah. And something God's been speaking to me about for years. Like I have a lot of gifting in ministry and, but he's always said to me, like, I want you to be in the marketplace. Yeah. So it builds faith and trust. So, I'd hear something and I'm like, I don't know what that means, but okay, I'm going to pray that over John. Yep. And I'm going to text it to him. And, I can't think of a specific example, but I know for sure, like I would send it and you're like, yes, that's it. Yep. And so we would just pray that. Yep. That's the way that's what I needed. I'm like, well, good thing Jesus gave it to me, because I didn't have any answers. Sorry, dude. Yeah. That's the beautiful thing about hearing God for other people. It's usually really clear. It seems like a little bit like, but what's that about? Sometimes, but yeah, for sure. One of the things that, one of our good friends and a guy who's much wiser and older than us, told me a number of years ago, when I began to make some real critical career decisions and everything, and start to ask God, like, okay, Lord, like I have these two options. They're both good options. What do I do? He said to me, and this is Steve, he said, John, you're going to have to really learn how to hear God's voice and follow him, because like nobody's really going to be able to tell you what to do as you progress in these kinds of things. And it really struck me. I was like, oof, yeah, I am, and so in that, like, I'm looking to God for guidance first and foremost. I'm open to what he'll say through other people. I'm open to the word of encouragement or the path to take, in a given situation or whatever. But ultimately it's like, Jesus is my captain. Like I'm following him. I'm trusting that he's going to give me the general direction. You know? Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think we got to bring this one in for a landing. There's a lot more that we could say, but I think we'll kind of park it there for the time being. And for those of you who've joined us, thank you for joining us on the OG Original Glory podcast. Again, I'm John Carlson, along with my boy KD. And you can check us out at originalglory.com, where you can find our gear and the blog and all kinds of resources. Peace.
Peace.